Hey, in this lecture we will talk a bit about the game loop and why we don't go ahead and write our game-specific code in the main function, typically in console applications that we may have written in C++ 101 and C++ 102, and also sometimes if you go ahead and develop in some other frameworks such as Qt, for example, you may go ahead and write your code in the main function. We don't do that when we develop in Unreal Engine because those functions are used for engine initialization. We will explore that on a high level in this lecture. So to continue on, let's talk a bit about the game loop and what that is. Following engine initialization, the typical game loop will process input, update the state of the game, and then render the results to the screen, right? As an example, down here we have the engine initialization, then we enter the main game loop. We process whatever input we have, we update the state of the game, and then we go ahead and render the results of that computation to the screen. Following the loop, we go ahead and we launch the shutdown process. This seems like a simple thing, but of course in modern applications, this can get really complicated with multi-threading and stuff like that, especially if you have something like Unreal Engine which has many sub-processes. In this high-level pseudocode example, we enter the main function, we launch the engine initialization, then we enter the game loop. So while the exit is not requested, so in other words the user has not requested the game to end, we process whatever input the player provides, we update the game state, and then we go ahead and we render the results to the screen. If the game exits, if we request to end the game for some reason, then we launch the shutdown process and we return. A couple of examples, we have the win main, and this is going to launch the Windows startup process here, and following that we have the launch Windows shutdown, and then we return. Okay. Also in the launch.cpp here, the engine will go through and do various things. So for example, we have pre-initialization, and in that, I'll just jump over to here, and basically in that process the low-level core modules are loaded. The engine is broken up into different modules, and in a similar way as we'll discuss, your game or a plugin, if you write a plugin, is part of a module as well. Back in the launch.cpp we have the guarded main, and if you scroll down a bit, you can see that we have the initialization code down here. But the point of this is you can see we have hundreds of lines of code, and also in the previous file that I showed you we have thousands of lines of code, so there's a lot going on. You have modules being loaded in and out, we have multi-threaded code as well. So the point of this demonstration is we do not go ahead and write our code in some main function in some entry point that is used for the engine's initialization and setup. A lot of initialization and low-level stuff happens before program execution reaches our game-specific logic and code. We are not really concerned with the startup process, the initialization, the game loop when using Unreal Engine. That really goes beyond the scope of what we are concerned with. We are really concerned with how do we actually get our code, how do we inject code into the system, how do we get something moving, how do we write basic gameplay elements, and that is really what we are concerned with. And for that we need to look at actors, pawns, and how input works, how we can do things per tick or per frame, and how we can write time-based movement, which is basically frame-independent movement, so that you have frame-independent movement when you're moving objects around and stuff like that. Those are all basic concepts. And then also game manager, so how can we manage all of the stuff that's going on in your levels and in your game. So those are all of the things that we are concerned with and that we will learn as a beginner when we write code in Unreal Engine, as opposed to how all of the initialization stuff happens. To wrap up this lecture, we do not alter the Unreal Engine game loop directly. In other words, we do not write code in the main function, as you may be familiar with in whatever other previous courses you may have worked in or frameworks that you have worked in. We will define game mode subclasses, so in other words we will derive from game mode, or we will create actors, or whether those are pawns that we can control with keyboard input. Then we can override the begin play and the tick functions, for example, in those classes. Again, as we derive from actor, for example. In that way we basically add or inject our game logic. The Unreal Engine then takes care of the rest.